On this episode of the Cabincast,
we'll be talking to the author of A Lakeside Companion, Ted Rulseh.
We talk about the ecology of lakes, how they came to be, what keeps them healthy, and how we can best care for them.
Let the journey begin.
Welcome to the Cabincast, your Getaway Primer.
The Cabincast is brought to you by Roughing It in Style. Roughing It in Style's family business was created to supply folks like you with unique furnishings that fit homes where memories are made. And like these memories, their handmade furniture and decor is made to last. They emphasize creative innovation in interior design, cabinet design, and custom furniture. Their designers are available to help you create spaces that are warm, inviting, and fit your unique style. There are 2 locations, one in the Northwoods of Wisconsin, in Harshaw, 10 miles south of Minocqua, and one out west in Fort Collins, Colorado. Find out more today at roughingItinstyle.com. So welcome. Today we're going to be talking to Ted Rulseh. He actually is a author that has a book for sale at Roughing It at our store. And it was such an intriguing book, and it's been really flying off the shelf. It's called A Lakeside Companion. And as we were developing the podcast, after just even browsing through his book, he was really one of the first guests that came to mind to bring him in. This book has a wealth of knowledge about not only living on the lake, but the ecology of lakes, the animals and how they interact with the lakes, how lakes were formed. I mean, pretty much any question you'll have about lakes, it answers. So I flagged Kristin to it, and we touched base with Ted, and he sounded like he was interested and came on. He was a fantastic guest.
He's fascinating. And I think one of my favorite parts is prepping for the interview and reading the book. I sound so smart when I talk to Brian and the kids. All the things I know about fish and lakes and ice fishing, and I sound so smart.
Yeah, Brian's got to be Kristin. That's you're making me look bad here,
right? Yeah. But no, it reads so well.
Yeah.
It's such an easy read for being nonfiction.
Yeah, and Ted has a background as a newspaper columnist in the local paper, the Lakeland Times. He also wrote another book about the Great Lakes that we'll share in our show notes. And he just has a really, really nice way of getting information across. I think, if you have your love for the lake, it's a great coffee table book for your guests to flip through.
It would be.
Yeah. So
he's like the dream professor you wish you'd had in college.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or to teach science to your kids at high school. He's just really fascinating. And our listeners will hear this in the interview. He teaches it to you in such a way that you can grasp.
Yep.
It makes it so user-friendly, this book is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I learned so much. And it really made me appreciate and think more about how special our lakes are too. Not just taking it for granted every day when we live by the lake. What were your first memories, Erik? Can you remember back to how old were you when you first started having time by the water?
So my first real lake memories are up on the Michigami Reservoir up in Michigan. And we used to kind of road trip up there. I've mentioned that before. And this is a reservoir with just very, very few homes on it. So when people talk about, it looked like the Canadian wilderness. Well, the Michigami Reservoir really looks like that. There's not houses around every bay. There's a dam on there. That's pretty cool. But if you stay in certain areas, you might as well be up in the middle of Canada all by yourself. So I just have really vivid memories of like the wide open water with just green trees in the background. And we used to explore the heck out of that lake. My folks had a little olive green pontoon boat named after my sister called the Kelsey Lynn. And, now when I see pontoon boats with all the bells and whistles, this wasn't that. This was a great boat. It was amazing. And I probably read 100 books laying on the back bench of that pontoon boat as
That's dreamy.
Yeah, as we just tooled around. And so when I think of just the lakes, nowadays we live in northern Wisconsin here, and there are a lot of lake homes. There's 2,000 lakes up here, and it's gorgeous, but there's very few lakes without the obvious touch of man. So my vivid memories of living on the lake are, or not even living, but just like when I picture a lake, that's the first thing I think about is the Michigami Reservoir. And at the time it was called Stewart's Way Dam Resort there. So what were yours?
Well, the first thing I was just thinking of as you were talking was how peaceful those memories are, you know, of laying there and reading and then just being surrounded by nature and just the lake bobbing you around on your pontoon as you float around. And my first memories are peaceful ones too. I grew up in Texas and I would go to summer camp and in Tyler, Texas and East Texas. And at the summer camp, there was a lake and my favorite thing to do was go fishing. And you'd go knock on the kitchen door after breakfast and they just had bamboo poles, nothing fancy, you know, with a string and a hook. And you'd go get leftover breakfast sausages. And then that's what you would use for your bait. And just, I think the simplicity of it, you know, just the bamboo pole and the string and the hook and a little leftover sausage and try to
straw hat.
You know, I didn't have the straw hat.
Okay. That's what I'm envisioning.
But you know what? It's my memory. I could have one if I want one, right?
Add one in.
Yeah, I'll add it in.
Yeah.
So I think just sitting there and waiting to catch the fish and how peaceful that would be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my first memories too. And some of the things I love most about being by the lake right now are also the peaceful times. When you do watch the eagles fly overhead, and I still love to take books on the boat, you know, like you were saying, I love to just sit there and watch the kids swim while I read, float. I love floating. So,
yeah. And Ted's chat and his book really, you know, no pun intended, you kind of go a little bit below the surface of the lake.
Right.
So when you enjoy the water, you're on top of the water, boating around, maybe swimming a little bit, but you really don't think about what makes everything kind of flow and work underneath the water. And I mean, when we talk about the ecology of the lake, unless you're part of like a lake association that's dealing with some of the issues that lake associations deal with now, I mean, you're aware of the things, but you don't think about it so often. And that's one of the things I really liked about his book was how it pulls you into that world in a little bit different way. And I think when you're done reading it, you sure appreciate the whole kind of cycle of life that goes on.
Definitely. And I think, you know, when you bring up the lake associations and why it's important to be involved with them, not even just money wise, but I know our lake association does cleanups at the beginning of the summer and everybody gets in their kayaks and goes around the shore and tries to clean things up if there are things around, and how important it is to keep our lakes healthy and, you know, how our yards are done and fertilizing. I mean, Ted goes into a lot of those things to give us advice about how to take good care of our lakes.
Yeah. It's just like, you know, back home, you might have a neighborhood association that wants to keep your neighborhood looking pristine. And when you live on the lake, you may own a home and you may own a bit of shore, but you're really entrusted with a very real piece of Mother Nature. And it's up to, you know, the group of people living there in a lot of cases to do the best they can to make sure, you know, as homes change hands or, you know, most of the lakes have nice public access, that it's something that everyone can share and take care of. So it's something we need to keep healthy.
Yeah, keep it great for generations to come.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of families, their lake homes or the resorts they come stay at have been part of their family's history for a long time. So I know they treasure that as well. They want to keep the lakes nice.
Yeah. And you had a favorite part of the book that you wanted to dive into?
Do. And it's right at the beginning.
Yeah.
Right at chapter 1. It just pulled me in right away to hook me into his style of writing. And it's called Putting in the Pier. The winter ice is good for making sure we don't take our lakes for granted. The opening of the water is like a reunion with a beloved friend, and the official welcome is putting in the pier. Here on Birch Lake, the water usually opens in mid-April. Sometimes the last of the ice lies up against our shore. Postponing my pier project, but only for a day or so. I look forward to this ritual much as I did putting up the Christmas tree when the kids were young. Only this perhaps is better, for all it pretends. Maybe you roll your pier into the water on wheels. Perhaps you maneuver whole sections of light aluminum frame. Maybe your pier stays in the water all year. My pier goes together like pieces from an erector set, and that adds to the childlike joy I feel in assembling it. Preparations are easy. Sweatpants over trousers, inside rubber hip boots. That water is cold. Hooded sweatshirt, ball cap and sunglasses, carpenter's square and level, adjustable wrench, ratchet wrench with socket, plastic zipper bag of bolts, nuts, and washers, and down the 57 lake front stairs I go. It's in my nature to rush through chores like leaf raking and garage cleaning, but I don't hurry this one. I savor each step, working with care. The pier stands are stacked on shore in the order removed last fall, so last out, first in. Set the first stand roughly to feet from the shore anchor, balance it in place, go get a side rail, bolt one end to the shore anchor, the other to the stand, just finger tight. Repeat with opposite rail. Check with the square, move the stand left or right as needed, check with the level. Usually it's fine since the same parts go in the same places as last year and the lake bottom of silty sand doesn't change much. Tighten down the nuts at the four corners and join the staccato ring of the ratchet. Continue with the remaining 3 frame sections and then the L section where the bench goes. While I work, sometimes an otter swims by and assumes a seat on a branch of the fallen pine tree along the shore of the neighboring lot. His growls tell me that for whatever reason, he does not approve of my work. Simple as this task may be, it never goes perfectly. A stand tips over with a splash. A side rail slips into the water. A nut escapes my grip, always at the deep end of the pier. And I have to fish it out, getting a soggy sleeve for the trouble. Then the frame is done. Laying on the sections of cedar decking is like building a plank road to a season of promise. Decking in place, bench installed, I sit for a while. The ice having left early, we can expect more than 7 months of open water. It starts now, today. Imagine the adventures, the simple joys, the wonders that await.
Yeah. So I think that gives a really good feel of how the book reads in general.
Yeah.
And that's right away. And it just continues. And he has that really poetic way of speaking about things that you'd normally read in a science book, but he sure paints a nice picture of it.
He does. I mean, I'm sure everybody listening to that, like I am, is just getting excited thinking about time on the water.
Yeah.
And I love the part about the otter swimming past and not approving of his work.
Right. Those otters, they can be really persnickety about putting docks in and making sure. You know, I was just thinking about that level sounds like a good idea. We don't use a level on ours, and it can be interesting.
Yeah, I think it might be a good idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So we hope you guys really enjoy our interview with Ted. We think you're really going to love it. All right. We'd like to welcome Ted Rulseh here. And Ted writes the newspaper column, The Lake Where You Live, in the Lakeland Times and the
Northwoods River News.
Northwoods River News, which are 2 periodicals up here in the Northwoods in northern Wisconsin by us, and is active in lake advocacy organizations, including the Wisconsin Citizen Lake Monitoring Network, the editor and publisher of several books on the Great Lakes region. He's the author of the Lakeside Companion, the book we're going to be talking about today, and On the Pond, Lake Michigan Reflections. He lives in our lake-rich region of northeastern Wisconsin. And welcome, Ted.
So thanks
welcome.
To the Cabincast.
Glad to be here.
It's great to have you.
Yeah, so Ted, if you want to dive in and just provide a little more background about yourself and, you know, what is it about lakes that have captured your attention in such a profound way that you're writing books about them?
Well, I grew up on Lake Michigan, a little town called Two Rivers on the east coast of Wisconsin. And Lake Michigan is kind of like my mother. The Northwoods lakes here are more like my friends. When I was 8 years old, my father took me and a brother up to a lake in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan called Duck Lake. It was Memorial Day weekend, and that was the first time I was exposed to the Northwoods, the loons, the eagles, these enormous trees, the big lake, the quiet, the wind and the pines, and I was hooked. I've just had a passion for lakes ever since then, and always at some point wanted to have a place up north, and my wife and I were finally able to put that together about 8 years ago.
Oh, fantastic.
I love the story that you told in the book about, because one of the things when I first started was to be curious about how someone who loves lakes like you do could pick a lake to live on. And then you talked about a neat story when you were out on a boat, and did you catch a fish or something happened to let you know, yes, this is the spot where we're going to buy a place?
Well, we vacationed on Birch Lake, where I now live, for about 20-some years with our kids, and always were kind of window shopping for property. Every time we'd come up, we'd take a trip around the lake and look at the for sale signs, and we were a young couple. We didn't have any money, so it really was just window shopping. But then you get on in life, you become a little more established, and then came the recession of 2008. And all of a sudden, lake property went in price from, are you kidding me, to, well, maybe it's possible.
Right.
So the last day of our vacation, it was 2009 in August. I took the boat across the lake to fish against this bed of reeds along the shore, and beyond the reeds, there was a for sale sign. And we had looked at that property a year before, and we knew that it had come down significantly in price. So I took a black and white Rapala plug and said, all right, if I cast this up against that reed bed and I catch a fish, then we're destined to buy this property.
Oh.
Yeah.
So uncharacteristic of me, I made a perfect cast, and up came this big fish, and wham, hit the lure. I reeled it in. It's a 19-inch largemouth bass. So I put the fishing rod away, drove back across the lake, and told my wife, guess what?
Fate.
Welcome home.
Fate has it.
Yeah, 2 years later, that December, we signed the paperwork to buy the property, and 2 years later, we built our little house, and somewhere in Birch Lake, there swims a very expensive fish.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there we
right?
go. That's
Yes.
fantastic.
Yeah, I love that story. I love hearing how people come to find their special place on a lake. So.
I meet so many people now who are coming up here to retire. We've lived up here full-time 6 years, and seems like that kind of thing is going around. People are moving up here. I talk to a lot of people. How long have you lived up here? Oh, 6, 7, 8 years.
Right.
So a lot of people are making homes.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons Roughing It's up here too, is just because there's so many people that they've spent so much time, even folks that have lived their whole life down in Chicago and, Milwaukee or the Twin Cities, and then they summered up here their whole life, or they've went to friends' vacation homes or summer camp, and it created such an indelible memory of living on the lake or even visiting the lake that they're like, that's where I want to be full time. And then they retire and move up here. So that's a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's great.
Sure is.
Yeah.
Yeah. So then, you've taken it another step further where you are writing these fantastic books. So the book we're talking about today, A Lakeside Companion, has just a wealth of knowledge. It's almost, to me, it's like a little bit of a Bible on all the different interesting things about the lake. So it's broken up into these chapters. So what has captured your soul and your imagination so much that you sit down and you write a book and you write newspaper articles about living on the lake?
Well, the first book I wrote was about Lake Michigan, and that was based on a newspaper column I wrote when I lived in the Two Rivers, Manitowoc area. It was called On the Pond. It became a real popular feature in that newspaper, and part of my ulterior motive in writing that column was to one day make it into a book. And so that came to pass in about 2003. And then something similar happened up here. I always said that if I moved north, I'd studied some lake ecology and field biology in college, and just loved lakes, loved to fish. And I thought, well, there's so much that people don't know and appreciate about their lakes. So if I ever move up north, I'm going to see if I can get the newspaper to let me write a weekly column about some aspect of lakes and lake science and lake lore. So that came to pass. I've been writing the newspaper column for 5.5 years now, never missed a week. And out of that came this book, which is published by the University of Wisconsin Press.
Oh, fantastic. So these are the articles that you've written for the newspaper, kind of in a condensed version, or did you kind of interconnect them and draw them together?
They're adapted from what's in the newspaper. A book is a little bit of a different read than a newspaper, so a lot of work went into converting it into a book form. Had a really good editor at UW Press who helped me a lot. So
good.
One of the things I think you're really good at when I'm reading the book, because it is scientific information that isn't always easy for me to understand, but you make it easy to understand. And you use a lot of great analogies that breaks it down. I mean, even when you were talking about your love of Lake Michigan as your mother and the, interior lakes, there are so many things. One of my favorites was when you're talking about the bass, because there's a whole chapter on fish called fins. And I loved when you're talking about the difference between the smallmouth bass and the largemouth bass. What did you say? One of them's khakis and bourbon, and one of them's beer and blue jeans.
Well, yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
And the largemouth bass is a barroom brawler, and the smallmouth bass is a sophisticated fighter.
Oh.
Yep. So no one should be afraid of this book because it's full of so much knowledge, because it is a fun read because of those things that you throw in like that.
Well, thanks for saying that. I am a writer and communicator by profession, so I deal a lot in my real job. I do a lot of writing that's very explanatory, and so that translates very well to a book like this. I didn't want to sound like some highfalutin scientist, try to bring it down so that anyone can enjoy and appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And your real job, are you a technical writer, or what do you do for your...
I'm a writer of... I write about technical topics for technical people, things like healthcare, insurance, energy management, heavy equipment, things like that.
Oh, fantastic. Okay.
Been doing that for 21 years now on my own.
Okay. So this is like a little extra treat where you can take your skill set that you have, but turn it into something that, that you're super passionate about.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Well, this book starts out talking about the basics of lakes. And one of the things that I thought was most interesting was talking about water. And you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the groundwater under Wisconsin would make a lake 100 feet deep. Is that what?
Boy, I'd have to go back in the book and check.
But there's so many facts like that just make you go, wow. But can you just say a little bit about the formation of lakes and the glaciers and kind of this area?
Yeah, the glaciers came down from the north and basically carved the depressions that became the lakes out of the earth, and the glaciers receded and left the lakes behind. It's interesting sort of how glaciers move. When I was a kid, I pictured glaciers as being this big chunk of ice kind of sliding by gravity down the landscape. It isn't really like that at all. It's kind of like the way a glacier moves is that it steadily spreads out from the base as you pile more weight on top of it. It's kind of like if you took a pail of sand and started pouring it onto a flat surface, you'd make a pyramid, and the bottom of that pyramid would just slowly spread out. And that's more or less how the glaciers moved, and very slowly, of course.
Sure. Over like a couple days, right?
How about thousands of years?
Yeah. And it's funny, when I was, learning about some of these basics in science class, and they taught us down in southern Wisconsin, they have the different areas like the driftless region and different things that they talk about the glaciers forming. You think about them receding and leaving all the lakes behind. And when you're little, even in 5th or 6th grade, they talk about this. And I'm like, man, they left the water behind when the ice melted, and there's the lake that's still the glacial lake that's there, that's left. But it's kind of all part of a system, if I understand it correctly from your book, that all of this is interconnected, and there's the different spring-fed lakes. And then can you kind of go into that? Yeah,
it is all connected. It starts with the rain, of course. The rain is part of the water system too, part of the water cycle. But the groundwater, the rivers and streams, the lakes are not separate things. They're all interconnected, one whole. So that groundwater infuses the lakes, and groundwater flows into the rivers. Rivers and streams flow in and out of the lakes, and it's all of a piece. In actual fact, a lake is, in a large sense, a depression in the earth that intersects the water table, which is the top of the groundwater.
Oh, that's really interesting. You mentioned that each lake looks like an island, and visually you think like, I'm on this lake, it's this separate thing. But envision it all interconnected. It absolutely makes sense.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You talked about how like Lake Superior is about 191 years old and Lake Michigan is about 99 years old. How do they decide about how the water turns over? And
yeah, I guess what you meant to say is that the water in Lake Superior takes all those years to turn over, and the same with Lake Michigan. And it depends on what the inputs and outputs to the lakes are. Lake Michigan and Lake Superior being these really deep bowls. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you have Lake Erie that has a retention, what we call a retention time of just a few years. So that's why Lake Erie was called a dead lake, but was able to be cleaned up so quickly once the Clean Water Act went into effect. The water comes in and goes out of that lake quickly. So if you stop the bad stuff coming in, pretty soon the clean water comes in, flushes it all out, and you have a lake where walleye fishing is just fabulous and has been for years. Of course, now they do have their problems with algae blooms in Lake Erie. There's some serious water quality issues there.
Like what causes the algae to like one lake to have a problem with algae versus one lake to not?
Generally, it's an excess of nutrients, especially phosphorus. Phosphorus is what we call a limiting nutrient. One way to think about that is think about what we here in northern Wisconsin call fish fries. If you have 100 pounds of fish and 100 pounds of French fries and only 2 pounds of coleslaw, you can't make very many complete fish fries. And phosphorus in the lakes is kind of like that. That's what's in short supply. But if you start introducing phosphorus to the lake from farm fertilizer or lawn fertilizer or pet waste or whatever source, 1 pound of phosphorus added to the lake will feed 500 pounds of algae. So you can see how easily we can get algae blooms in our lakes if we don't take proper care of the things we do on the shoreline.
Can you talk about that a little bit? I know you mentioned in your book a lot of the things that we can do to take care of our lakes. So what are some of the things you highly recommend we do?
Well, the best thing, what I've learned about the best gift you can give your lake is to have a natural shoreline. Keep the vegetation and the trees, the native things that are already there. Don't cut it all down and mow all the way down to the water's edge. If someone's already done that to your property when you buy it, the best gift you can give your lake is to plant a buffer strip starting from the water's edge up your lawn to 30, 40, 50 feet. You can let that just quit mowing that amount of grass. Let things grow if you want to. You can do some natural landscaping with native plants. What that does is it'll stop the runoff coming down from your property, from your house, your driveway, and your yard. And the nutrients will get taken up in that vegetation on the shore instead of going into the water and feeding the algae. Another really important thing to do is if you have a septic system, which most of us lake residents do, is take good care of it. Make sure you're pumping it on schedule, have it inspected, and make sure that's not polluting the lake. Picking up pet waste, treating your leaves properly. You don't want to be blowing or raking leaves into the lake. The idea is the lakes are going to naturally accumulate nutrients over time, but we don't want to do things that speed up that process.
What about fertilizing our yards?
Well, we don't do it. I guess I feel as if that's not something that we should do, or at least take very good, do it very judiciously if you have to do it at all.
Right.
So a lot of lake properties, you hear people talk about keeping it the natural, the pine needles fall down. They don't let the grasses grow. Is it better to keep it as a clean property past that strip where you just let the natural vegetation grow, or are you trying to remove leaves and keep that clean?
We rake our leaves, of course. We have our septic system is between our house and the lake, and over that we have no mow grass, and the leaves fall on that. We rake them off into the woods so that they don't kill the grass that's growing. But we've chosen to keep our property almost completely natural. We bought this wooded lot, and we removed enough trees to build the house and a garage, but between the septic system and the lake, even though we legally could have cut enough trees to make a viewing corridor, we chose to cut nothing. So we have a filtered view of the lake. The only 2 trees we removed were 2 little kind of weak saplings down at the lake shore where we wanted to build a little place for a fire pit. So that's what we've chosen to do, and not everybody has to do it that way. There's lots of nice ways that you can have yourself a really nice lake view and yet keep your shoreline in a very natural condition.
talk a little bit about the change in the lake that happens as winter comes.
Oh, this is so interesting. It
Yes.
really starts in the fall. In the summertime, the lake is what we call stratified. It's split into two layers. There's a warm, less dense layer on the surface that's well oxygenated from wind and wave action. Down below that, there's a layer of colder water that's more dense. So the two layers don't mix very much, and the water down below is very low in oxygen. Then as fall comes on, the temperatures start to cool down. The lake water temperature on the surface falls until it's about the same as in that lower layer down toward the bottom. At that point, the whole lake can mix. So the wind and the wave action mixes the lake and gives it a complete infusion of oxygen. It's like your lake is taking a nice, big, deep breath. Yeah. So heading into winter, the lake is holding a great deal of oxygen. And what's even better, cold water holds a lot more oxygen than warm water. Almost water at about the freezing point will hold about twice as much, not quite twice as much oxygen as water in summer at, say, 80 degrees. So going into winter, just before that ice comes in, there's more oxygen in the lake than there will be the entire rest of the year. And then once the ice comes in, the lake has this big full scuba tank full of oxygen that's going to get the fish and the other creatures in the water through the winter.
And what's different about the fish and the turtles and the frogs? Like during winter, what are they up to?
The turtles and frogs are largely hibernating. The turtles they'll kind of bury themselves mostly in the mud, and they'll actually breathe through their skin. The fish will be active, but not as active. They don't need to eat nearly as much. They're cold-blooded, so everything about them, everything in the lake, all the biochemical processes slow down when it gets colder. So the fish, they're moving around, they're eating, but they don't need very much oxygen to get by. So they're just kind of having a long, lazy, slow winter.
So when you mentioned that the oxygen gets them through the winter when it is all stirred up, does the ice basically seal the lake off from new oxygen being introduced?
Yeah, it pretty much does. There's always a little open water along the shore. There's some places where the water's open. There might be a stream coming into the lake that's carrying some oxygen, but for the most part, the lake is kind of like a closed system. And there are some shallow lakes where that's a problem because there's only a certain amount of oxygen that this shallow water can hold, and that's why we get winter kills. The winter kill is not because the lake freezes down to the bottom. It's because the fish basically suffocate because they run out of oxygen.
Oh, so when you're ice fishing, you could be like, I'm actually helping fish by drilling holes. I'm just providing oxygen for all the fish.
Well, you could say you're helping a little. Sure.
Yeah, oh sure. Yeah, well, I can think that at least.
There you go.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but sure.
Yeah, just making breathing holes for the fish that breathe underwater.
So you talked a little bit about starting to ice fish a little bit. So talk about the difference you feel between ice fishing and summer fishing personally.
Oh, I put off ice fishing for so long. I just couldn't get used to the idea of all the hassle that goes with it. My old chemistry teacher in college used to say that what most people do while ice fishing, he can do while sitting in his living room, if you take my meaning. But I finally decided, well, I live on a lake. I really should learn how to ice fish. So I got myself into it. I just bought a bare minimum of equipment, a hand drill and a couple of rods and a couple jigs, and actually started bouncing around to some other lakes besides my own because I was after panfish, and my lake wasn't much of a panfish lake. And lo and behold, I actually came to like it. It's not something that I would sit out there all day and do, but I really enjoy sitting over a hole in the ice, working a jig rod. There's a certain zen about it. The fish bite so delicately, you really have to have your attention focused on what you're doing. You feel the smallest little tug, and you jerk the rod up and reel in a nice bluegill. It's a lot of fun.
You talk about the zen of fishing. I think you how did you say that you can't worry about anything when you're out fishing?
A wise person said it's impossible to fish and worry at the same time.
Oh, that's a great saying.
I find that to be true.
Yes. Yeah. So what's your favorite fish to catch and eat?
Well, to eat perch or walleyes, to catch smallmouth bass. They're just such fighting, sporty, beautiful fish. I can't remember the last time I've kept and killed one. I just can't bring myself to kill them to eat.
Yeah, it's funny with ice fishing is when I moved up here, I had zero reference with ice fishing, except you drive by the lakes up here and see the towns that explode in the Northwoods. And these like overnight, as soon as the ice is barely thick enough to drive a truck on, there's guys out there putting almost, it looks like an entire new town exists on some of these lakes. And, people are staying there for days at a time. They just leave to go get groceries and, mostly beer, I imagine, and then head back to their little ice shanty in the wintertime. And, they live there almost until, usually every year somebody's fishing a truck out because they didn't want to leave the town they created. And
that's right.
Yeah. So that's a lot of fun.
One of the things included in the book are Army Corps of Engineers recommendations for ice thickness safety. So,
right. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers recommendation, some of them are less than 1.75 inches ice thickness, keep off. 1.75 inches, one person on skis. 2 inches, one person on foot or skates. 7 inches, a car. 10 inches, a larger truck up to 14,000 pounds. So those are recommendations. I'm always very conservative when it comes to going out on the ice. The mantra I follow is, if in doubt, don't go out. You just never know.
Well, I grew up in Texas till I was 18 years old and moved north to go to college. And so the frozen lake is still fascinating to me, where my husband grew up in Wisconsin and he's used to it, And I still, if I'm in the truck, I have to roll the windows down. The first time I cried when I went out on a frozen lake, I just was so unsure of it. So it's great to have those guidelines to give you something to go off of. And
I think being a little scared, a little timid is a good thing.
I think
it
so
keeps
too.
you from doing things you really shouldn't.
Speaking of things you really shouldn't do, I've fallen through a frozen lake before.
Really?
Oh.
Yeah. We used to live a couple blocks away from Lake Minocqua, and every year we'd go with a group of friends, and this is before we had kids, we'd go snowshoe pub crawl. So we'd go get our snowshoes on, strap them on, and then we'd cross our driveway and cross the neighbor spot and start hiking across the lake. We'd go out on the town, have a good time, and then on our march back, we usually take the same route. Well, this time we took a little different route, and myself and a friend were ahead of a group a little ways, maybe 25 yards ahead, just walking a little faster. And I started to notice that the ice looked a little bit different, just slightly different, but it was just a thin area of the ice that looked different. And we were pretty close to shore. We were maybe 30 yards away from shore. Well, I took one step and all of a sudden the ice broke just completely out underneath me. But luckily, living in the Northwoods and going out on the ice, it made me really nervous too when I came up here, because in southern Wisconsin, there's not a ton, there's lakes down there, of course, but I didn't spend a lot of time growing up and maneuvering frozen lakes. So there's a certain anxiety that you feel. So I looked up how to get out of the ice if you fall in. And what you're supposed to do is don't panic, because if you fall through and your head goes under, which luckily mine didn't, I was wearing a pretty heavy suit and just went down in the snowshoes, I think helped slow down the fall. I went in, and you're supposed to kind of level yourself out and get yourself horizontal and just get your elbows up on the edge of the ice and do a slow kick, like a slow paddle in the water, until you can kind of army crawl yourself out onto the ice. And that's what I did. But, I was up to my chest in ice water, and everybody else, of course, it was nice because a bunch of people didn't go through. My buddy didn't go through. Luckily, he was in a slightly different spot. So they backed up and went a different direction. And I crawled forward towards shore and walked and got there. And we were only a couple blocks away, and I was wearing warm clothes. So, it was okay. But even in the couple blocks that I was going, my legs started to stiffen up. Your chest tightens up from the cold. You can see how fast hypothermia sets in. Well, I went back and looked at it during daytime, and somebody had an aerator running.
Oh, sure.
So there was a layer of, bubbles and water that someone was keeping. They had a permanent pier, and it was keeping their pier, free from ice, which is perfect in that little area. But a stream of that, and it must have been the way the channel or the water flow underneath the ice was, created just a thin strip, maybe only 3 feet wide, where the ice was, paper thin versus the rest of the lake was, 6, 8, 10 inches thick. There were trucks out on the ice everywhere else. So it didn't seem like a dangerous situation, but things can turn. And maybe if we weren't pub crawling, I would have probably noticed.
Right. Well, I'm glad there was a happy ending too.
Yeah.
Well, it's like you say, you never know. And with falling through the ice, drowning isn't your problem. Hypothermia, like you mentioned, is your problem. You can last maybe 15 minutes in water that cold before you become pretty much non-functional. So you've got to be able to get yourself out. One thing my son made me a couple of pegs with a nail sticking out of one end, and they're tied to a string, so you can run the string through your jacket sleeves and have these things ready in case you'd fall in. You could kind of spike your way back up onto the ice.
Oh, wow.
And they usually recommend when you try to go to pull yourself out in the direction that you came.
Oh.
Because that's where the ice is probably stronger.
Sure. Yeah, my situation, I was probably lucky that it was just a channel of that instead of continuing to break ice in the way,
right,
way that you're going.
I talked to a friend one time who went completely under, and luckily he had known what to do too. And he said, it's not what you think, that you think you should go to where it's light up above you, but you should go where it's dark. That's
Really?
where the opening is.
Really?
We should probably check our facts on that before we publish it. But that's what his story was.
Interesting.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
So tell a little bit about the process of writing the book. How long did the book take you? And
well, it was about really 3+ years of the newspaper columns, and then I started compiling it into chapters. And first I made a proposal to the University of Wisconsin Press and found out that they were interested, and there were certain things that they wanted me to do, things that I had written in newspaper style that they wanted to see written in more of a book style. So I had to go back through the whole thing with some really good direction from them and rework it so that it fit the book format. It's a lot of the subject matters, a lot of the subjects covered are what was actually contained in a column, but it's written in more of a book form. And the reason for going with the kind of format that I did with just a page and a half on each topic is that it's just a nice, pleasant read that way. It's not like reading a tome. You can sit down on your couch at night before or after dinner and just read a section or two, and it's not like a continuing saga that you have to keep up with.
it is like that. It is a great book that you can pick up and read just sitting on the couch like that and enjoy. Do you have a favorite spot to write in?
I have an office that is an annex to our garage, and we've got a woods and water view from there, so that's where the magic happens, so to speak.
What's a favorite animal encounter you've had?
Oh, I think my favorite was last summer before last. My grandson Tucker was interested in thistles, and I had seen some giant thistles along one of the roads, so I put him in the car and said, "Come on, Tucker, let's go see a giant thistle." Well, the giant thistle wasn't on the road where I thought it was going to be. Someone had cut it, so we went down this different gravel road, and instead of seeing a giant thistle, Tucker saw his first bear.
Oh. Exciting.
The bear came out of the woods and ran across the road. It was a pretty young one. I wouldn't say a cub, but a pretty small bear. So that was a real cool thing to experience with him.
That was great to have him along for that.
Another really cool one was I was riding my bike on a road about 5 miles from where I live, and there was a roadkill in the middle of the road, and inspecting that roadkill was a badger.
Wow.
I'd never seen a badger before except in a zoo. So I got a little closer and thought I better stop because I know they aren't really friendly.
Wow.
But the badger saw me and it kind of flowed down across the road and into the ditch and away.
You're the first person I've talked to who's had a badger encounter. Have you, Erik, have you had anybody?
I have not seen a badger out in the woods. I've seen badger dens or holes that they call it before, but I've never encountered one in the wild.
You said you like to snorkel around the lake and see what's going on. That's how you've learned a lot of things.
Oh, that's so much fun. Our lake isn't really a super great snorkeling lake, although it is in June when the water is still fairly clear. But yeah, you get to inspect, go through the reed beds and go through places where you think there are fish. And one of the things about our lake that amazes me is how good care people take of it. In all the snorkeling I've done, I can't remember the last time I picked a bottle or a beer can off the bottom. It's just pristine. One of my favorite experiences snorkeling, I had stopped along the edge of a reef to clear my mask and take a rest. When I went back in the water, I looked down and there was like 3 or 4 big smallmouth bass swimming around my legs, just like they were a couple of tree trunks.
Wow.
And they just stayed there for the longest time, and I had so much fun watching them. Of course, I went back there with my fishing rod that evening and caught nothing.
Yeah.
It's just the way it goes.
See, I just picture you snorkeling and trying to find a school of fish. And if you overhear what's going on in the school of fish, you can pick up a lot of information about the lakes from what the teacher's teaching.
Yeah, I guess if I talked fish, I could.
Yep. I think you also have something you go out and fish in. I just picture this big inner tube around you. Is that what it is?
It's more like a floating easy chair. It's called a float tube. And you sit down in it, your legs go through it, and on your feet are flippers, like from when you're snorkeling. And there's a couple of, I guess, look like chair arms and a back, and you just kick yourself along in that float tube and cast for fish.
And there's some nice cup holders in those chairs too.
Actually
Okay, because that's the important.
And there's zippered compartments where you can put a little tackle box or a box of bait or something.
This might be a thing to put on a Christmas list for some fishermen out there. That sounds like perfect.
Not many people do it. I think mostly trout fishermen are the ones who use the float tubes, and I don't really do it as much as I really should. I haven't actually done it on my own lake. I've done it on a couple of smaller lakes and cast for bluegills.
You talked about some of the best places to fish sometimes in the lake, and bank beating, is that what it's called, where fishermen are fishing close to shore?
Well, there's a fishing guide up here named Joe Bucher, and his term for people who only fish along the shoreline is bank beaters. Mm-hmm. Now, the reality is that there is good fishing along the shoreline at certain times of year and certain times of day, but for the most part, the best fishing is out on what we call the humps or the sunken islands, a place where the water is maybe 15 feet deep, and then all of a sudden comes up to 10 or 5, and there's a pile of rocks there or a sandbar or a weed bed, and that's where a lot of the fish hang out. So if you discover one of those spots, that's generally very promising.
I'm hoping that all the fishermen that like to fish between my kids' swim platform and our pier will be listening to that, because they love to come right in there where we're hanging out and fish. So I'm hoping they'll go out on the
I wonder why they do that.
I don't know. But
yeah, I think they just like
them otherwise.
see how close they can cast their thing into people without actually hitting somebody.
Right. So talk about some of the best things to do to help kids fall in love with their lake and your grandkids.
Oh boy. Well, one of the things that I did for my grandson Tucker, who's going to be 8 years old next May, is I bought him a microscope, and I cleaned some fish up, and I took some scales off the fish, and I said, Tucker, you can tell the age of a fish by looking at the scales, because they have rings just kind of like trees do. And so his dad helped him put the fish scale under the microscope, and he said, oh, this fish was 3 years old. So that, and just getting kids out on a nice canoe ride early in the morning when you might see wildlife along the water. Fishing with kids, of course, is great. Just take them out where they can catch lots of fish. When they're little, they don't care about size. Although both my 6-year-old and my 7-year-old grandson, they've each caught a muskie on the lake where I live.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Yeah, with a little help from Grandpa, of course.
Right.
But just getting them exposed, swimming, anything you normally do on the lake. I think I'm doing a pretty good job of getting my grandkids hooked. It's one of my missions as a grandpa.
Good.
You sound like a very fun grandpa.
Well, I like to hope so.
Yeah. Yeah, I loved your dedication at the beginning. To my wife, Noelle, but most of all to our children, Sonia and Todd, and our grandsons, Tucker and Perrin, mm-hmm. for whose benefit our lakes and resources must be preserved and protected. I thought that sums it up so well.
Well, we really have to take good care of our lakes. The lakes are under stress. I like to say, in a way, we're sort of loving our lakes to death. Mm-hmm. We all want lake homes, and we want to do things with our lake properties to make them the way we want them. And if we're not careful, we can put too much stress on the lake, too much runoff, too much nutrients. And we all have to really think about what we do on our properties.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's interesting how, there are lake associations at almost every lake or chain of lakes that have been created and exist to, prolong the lifespan and make sure that the lakes are as healthy as they can possibly be. And it sounds like that's something you're really active in. You go and speak at different associations on how to create a positive environment.
The lake associations are just some of the most dedicated, caring people that you'd ever want to meet. I meet so many great people when I go around speaking. On our lake, we have what's called the Friends of Birch Lake. It's really amazing how strong our membership is. I hear a lot of lake associations say they only have 50% of the people who have property on the shoreline are members of their association. And our lake, I'd venture to say it's more like 80 or 90%. And there's really good alignment in our group about what we want to do to improve the lake. We want to improve the fishery. We want the weed beds to come back. We want to keep it clean. And I serve as the education coordinator for the Friends of Birch Lake. I used to be treasurer. But yeah, lake associations are really a very important line of defense for our lakes.
Now, a lot of what we deal with up here on the lakes and that you hear about mostly in the news and what lake associations are battling are invasive species. Now, is that as prevalent as you hear about in the news? Are there certain lakes that are more susceptible to that? Or is it just something, because I mean, every boat launch and every station, it's, in big letters and big signs, they talk about keep your boat clean. Make sure there's no vegetation on your boat, because that stuff is a lot of times humans that are making it travel from lake to lake as people move their boats around. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, it's a really important issue. And, every lake, every year, it seems like another lake gets infested. Just recently, just this past summer, one of my favorite fishing lakes, which is Hasbrook Lake near Lake Tomahawk here, Eurasian water milfoil was discovered next to the boat landing, which is usually where they get introduced. Another very beautiful lake in Vilas County called Plum Lake, spiny water flea was discovered. That's a tiny little organism that tends to eat the native plankton that the fish feed on. So it's a real important issue. People really need to take good care of their boats. The signage is there. It's helpful. There's what we call Clean Boats, Clean Waters volunteers who actually staff the landings and instruct people on how to clean their boats. But my own opinion, there's a whole lot more that needs to be done, because our lakes, so many of them are just an open invitation to these invaders. We don't have the landings staffed enough hours during the year. We don't necessarily have every fisherman or every boater well educated on what to do. I mean, I've had to really re-examine the way I behave when it comes to moving my boat from lake to lake. I try not to lake hop anymore, go to one lake per day and that's it, clean the boat when I get home. So it's really something that has to be paid attention to.
And when you talk about cleaning, I mean, and that I've heard of the milfoil. I hadn't heard of the other one that you mentioned. When you talk about cleaning a boat, is it important to just wash it off like you wash a car? Or should you use, are you supposed to use like a chemical to really make sure it's clean? Are there more, tenacious invasive species? And I guess a follow-up question on that would be, when we say invasive species, does that mean from different lake areas within the U.S.? Because when you talk about animals, they talk about invasive species, like you might end up with an African animal in Texas, right? Running around in Texas and breeding. Or is it just like a species from another type of lake or a different lake area that creates a negative impact?
They arise from in various ways. My lake has rusty crayfish. This is a very aggressive form of crayfish that'll outcompete the natives, and it was actually introduced to the lakes. They're native to down in Kentucky, Tennessee, that area, and what is believed to have happened is fishermen brought them up in their bait buckets, and when they got done fishing, they emptied their bait buckets into the lake. And the way that population of rusty crayfish can explode, on Birch Lake, we witnessed the explosion of rusty crayfish. It was just a few. You could see them in there. They weren't really bothering anything. But then we missed a couple of years coming to our rented cottage on Birch Lake and came back. And if you stuck a flashlight down into the water at night, it would almost make you sick. There were so many crayfish. The whole bottom was practically moving. And entire weed beds where I used to fish were wiped out, because that's what they do. They'll pull the weeds out and they'll eat them. And pretty soon there's hardly any weeds left in the lake. So that's one kind of invasive species. We get certain invasive species arise because people buy them for their ponds at home. They're sold on the pond market, and someone somehow lets them turns them loose into a lake, and they have they're very prolific. They can just take over a lake or the landscape. Milfoil, Eurasian water milfoil. I think it's obvious that came from another part of the world. It's really prolific. Some of our lakes just have great big mats of it. You hardly drive a boat through. And then we have the little things like the spiny water flea, and then there's always the threat. The thing that's taken over Lake Michigan, where I come from, is the zebra mussel.
Yeah.
Also another kind of mussel called the quagga mussel. But zebra mussels have been found in a lot of lakes over in Minnesota. It's a really big problem, and zebra mussels have little larvae called veligers, and if you just have a little bit of water in your boat and there's some of those swimming around in there, you can take your boat to another lake, empty that water into the lake, and infect it. So job number one is to get the things, the weeds, the things that you can see off your boat and off your trailer. Drain the water out, drain the live well, drain your motor. There was a sign in my doctor's office. It had a picture of a kid washing with his hands full of all kinds of green and purple and yellow, ugly, creepy little things. And the words on the poster said, "If germs were bigger, would you wash your hands more often?" And it's kind of like that. If the bad guys that can infect our lakes were bigger, would you think more about decontaminating your boat?
Yeah.
Great way to think about it. Very true.
It's interesting that, you need a license to drive a car more for personal safety and public safety in that way. But you'd almost think there'd be like a boater's safety, not like wear your life jacket and where you think, but there'd also be like a indoctrination into boating and how the proper way to transport a boat and take care of your boat to protect the resource that's out there.
There are courses that are given. We have most of the counties in Wisconsin here have an aquatic invasive species specialist, and they'll give clinics on how to take care of your boat. They'll give clinics to the Clean Boats, Clean Waters volunteers and how they need to help people. It's some of us are of the opinion that as a condition of getting a boating license, renewing your license for your boat, you should have to pass an exam on how to properly prevent invasive species.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like a hunter safety, you can have a boating safety for the environment and to take care of lakes and protect things.
Right.
Does make sense.
So what are you still curious about?
Oh, lots of things. Right now I'm working on another book, and it's going to be about something we talked about earlier, and that is how we're loving our lakes to death and what we can do about it. And as part of that, I want to really capture the mystique of the lakes, how deeply people here care about the lakes. There's just something about a Northwoods lake, and having grown up with one, and we're in danger of forfeiting some of that magic if we allow our lakes to get too overdeveloped and overused.
True. I'm excited. You're going to write another book. That's great news.
It's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, and this one isn't from articles, right? So you'll be starting from scratch.
From research, right?
Okay.
Lots of interviews, lots of reading.
Well, you'll have to promise to come back on when it's done.
Oh, that'll be a while.
And share it with us. Well, we'll still be around.
We will still be around. and in the meantime, we've talked about having you, drop by or either call in or leave some little blurbs and some little lake facts to share with our audience over time too. That we'd love to have you, just introduce little blurbs. And the way you wrote the Lakeside Companion almost makes that perfect, where there's little chunks and facts and fantastic comparisons that, we'd love to keep sharing with our audience and more specific things. And, we'd love to have that as part of the Cabincast. I'd
be glad to work with you on that.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, so where can people find you or see more of your work? Are you on any social media, or is it just are you continuing to write the articles?
Right. I'm in the two papers every week.
Yep.
I'm too old fashioned, I guess, to be on social media. I guess I should be, though. I should get with it. It's one of my projects.
The grandkids can help you with that.
Yeah.
Right. Especially my son, my 34-year-old son could really give me a tutorial.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Ted, thank you so much for coming on the Cabincast. We really appreciate you stopping by.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Cabincast. You can find details and more information in the show notes on our website at www.thecabincast.com. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen so you won't miss a single episode. Follow us on your favorite social media channels. You can find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at The Cabincast. We'd also love to hear from you. We want to hear your getaway and cabin stories. For a chance to have your story featured on an upcoming episode, email us at getaway@thecabincast.com. Until next week, enjoy the journey.